Hi, I'm Kimmy with On William Street, and this week we are back to talk about how to resize a quilt block. So when you have a pattern or you have a quilt block that you're making, it's always set to come out to a certain size. And while that's great for the quilt for the pattern itself, every once in a while you just want to be able to make that quilt block a different size to serve a different purpose. And sometimes you would think it's just as easy as dividing it in half if you want it to be half the size. But it isn't quite that simple. So today we're going to kind of walk you through the process and some things to watch for if you are looking to make a block size either bigger or smaller. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is if you are doing traditional piecing. You're cutting out the blocks, you're sewing them together. How you're going to go ahead and approach that so you can resize those. Later on in the video we will talk briefly about foundation paper piecing as well, so you can kind of understand how you would need to adjust that. That's going to be a little bit of a different process. So here we have our 18-inch block. This is our B block 1 from the quilt along that we're doing. And on this side, I have this block resized so that this one is going to be a 9-inch finish. So it's half, technically a quarter, but the measurements are half what they were in the original block. So there are going to be a few different steps that we need to walk through and a few different things that we need to look through on the pattern before we can go ahead and decide the measurements that we need to start with. So when resizing a block, for our sample block here, we have our Ohio star block. And this one is made up of a few different parts. This is actually just a 9-patch block. And anytime that I'm doing a 9-patch, I am going to want my finished block to measurement to be divisible by 3. It's going to make it a lot easier. You could do this as a 10-inch block, but then you're going to be dealing with 1/3 inches and it's going to be a little bit messy. So if I've got a 9-patch, I know in my head, I'm going to try to make it work out to be 9 inches, 12 inches, 15 inches, 18 inches, something that you can divide 3 into quite easily. And that's going to really help. So this one we have 3 different, really just 2 different parts. We have our quarter square triangles and we have our blank squares. Anytime you have a shape that is a rectangle or a square and it's all straight cuts, it's really easy to figure out how to cut the new size. So on this one, these are my 6.5-inch squares, are the ones that are just going to make my corner squares here. So because I started with an 18-inch block and I went to a 9-inch block, I know that I'm going to want everything to be half the size. All my measurements are going to need to be half. So down here, I'm going to take this, and the first thing you need to do is remove the seam allowance. You don't want to change the size of the seam allowance, whether it's a 9-inch block or an 18-inch block. We're going to want that to be our quarter square. So that's going to be a 1/2 inch per block. So I first take my 6.5, and I'm going to minus that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and that's going to leave me with a 6-inch finished block, and this is where we want to start with. Now I'm going to take my 6-inch finished block, and because I know that I want it to be half the size, I'm going to divide it by 2, and that's going to leave me with a 3-inch finished block. This also works if you're making it bigger. You could simply multiply that by 2 and you'd start with a 12-inch block. It doesn't matter what size you're going. And then I'm going to add my seam allowance back on afterwards. You could also definitely go ahead and do it a 12-inch block. You're just going to need to address your proportions. Okay, so now for this part, we're going to go back to our high school math. And this is if we have something that's not easy, like half size or twice as big. So first we're going to start with the size that we want our block is right now, over X. And this needs to be equal to the size that our block is, the finished block is, over the size that we want it to be. So say we want it to be 12 inches. Now all we have to do is cross multiply. 6 times 2 is 72. It's going to be equal to 18x. Divide both sides by our 18. And x is equal to, I should have done this ahead of time, 4. Right? Missy's going to double check me while we do that, but so it should be 4. So that means that my measurement now is going to be 4. Then I'm going to add that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to cut my block up 4.5 inches. And you're going to need to go ahead and use that same proportion for each and every step throughout the process. But we're going to go back to the half for the rest of the video just to make things a little bit easier. So that process is going to work for our gray one as well, because it, as we can see here, is also a square. So that's going to end up being the same, 3.5 inches instead of the 6.5 inches. Now where it gets a little bit trickier is on our quarter square triangles. We want these to finish out at 3.5-inch squares, unfinished. We know that because we know that we want it to be the same size as these squares. But now we have to figure out what size are we going to cut those to start. Here we start with a 7-inch, but if we cut that in half at 3.5 inches, and add our 1/2 inch back, that leaves us with a 4-inch square. By the time we've cut our seams and split those up, that 4-inch square is probably not going to be quite big enough. So we're going to work backwards. And the first thing we know is that we're going to need to be making half square triangles twice, and then adding those together. An easy kind of number for half square triangles is just a 1/2 inch per size. If you want to definitely make sure that you have enough. A lot of people will add a 3/4 inch, but if you have a 1/2 inch, that's probably going to give you the leeway that you need. So you would go back and we would know that these need to be a 1/2 inch bigger than our finished size at 3.5 inches. So we're going to cut, so this would be a 4-inch, but then we need to add one more for that second step because it's a 1/4 square triangle, and we're going to be cutting it again, and that's going to give us 4.5 inches to start with. So that way when we cut them out, sew everything down, it's going to be the size we want. So figure out the size that you want it to be at the end, and then work backwards to get up to your cut size if you have things like half square triangles or 1/4 square triangles. If you're dealing with something that has templates, it's a little bit different. So this one is our scrap flower template, and it prints out as a 7-inch block. So because this is a template, I go ahead, when you print it, you normally are going to print with no scaling. You're going to print it full size. This one I printed at 75%. And how I did that is just in your printer settings. I just changed it to 75%. That way I know that it's going to be 3/4 the size of that. I didn't do the math. I'm not sure exactly what size that's going to be ahead of time. It's going to be roughly 5.25 inches is your finished block. However, where you have to really watch here is it's not going to change anything inside. Go ahead and piece it together just the way that you would want. But if you see here, when I lay my 1/4 inch seam on here, it is significantly smaller. So all you really need to do with that is make sure that when you cut it out, you're not cutting on that seam. You can either redraw yourself a new seam to start with, or when you cut it out, just make sure that you're lining up your ruler on the finished line seam and not on, I'm not going to have enough here in between these two blocks, but you get the idea. You're not going to line it up on this seam to cut. You're going to line it up here and make sure that you're cutting your 1/4 inch out. That way you're still maintaining that same seam, but you're getting the smaller block. If you have a block that you're looking to make a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger, definitely don't get overwhelmed. Just take it step by step at a time. Look at the different components, break it apart, and figure out what's the construction for those components, and go work backwards so that you can decide what the starting measurements need to be. Don't forget to take that 1/2 inch seam away first, reconfigure all your numbers, and then add the 1/2 inch seam back at the end so that you always have your 1/4 inch seam around the whole block when you're finished. So as always, if you have any questions, definitely let us know. Leave us a comment. We will come back and answer and help out any way that we can. If you follow us on Instagram or Facebook, we post fun stuff there going on all the time. And we would love it if you subscribed, hit the bell so that you get notified when we have a new video. And we'll see you next time. Bye.